Good afternoon. I'm Robert Pondicio, a senior fellow here at AEI and the James Q. Wilson Program in K-12 Education Studies. Thank you for joining us for this event, bringing high expectations back to education. And I want to thank, in particular, the Fordham Institute and the Progressive Policy Institute for partnering with AEI on today's event. Let's begin. It is an honor to introduce Stephen Wilson, a truly courageous and visionary leader in education. For more than 3 decades, Stephen has dedicated his career to a fundamental question. Can we provide a rich and engaging liberal arts education, the kind long afforded to children of privilege, to all children? Stephen's journey began long before the contemporary debates over charter schools and so-called no excuses models. His work in the early 1990s helped shape the landmark 1993 Massachusetts Education Reform Act, and he later chaired the board of Building Excellent Schools, an organization that launched some of the highest performing charter schools in America. But it was his time as the CEO of the Ascend network of charter schools in Brooklyn, where the question of high expectations in education was put to its most rigorous test. Ascend schools gained national recognition for their remarkable success in closing the achievement gap. Under Stephen's leadership, Ascend students, predominantly low-income students of color, outperformed their peers across the city and state while immersed in a curriculum that included Shakespeare, Auden, the Dutch masters, and so on. However, Stephen's commitment to an academically rigorous, knowledge-rich education led to his very public dismissal from Ascend in the wake of a controversy over a blog post in which he critiqued contemporary education trends in education that he saw as undermining the pursuit of academic excellence. In an article about his defenestration, the New York Times asked, and I quote, "Was it a racially dubious blog post, or did a charter school board seize a chance to get rid of an arrogant autocrat?" More on that in a moment. Rather than retreat, Stephen has transformed his experience into a powerful book to be published early next year, tentatively titled The Lost Decade, Returning to the Fight for Better Schools in America. I've had the privilege to read the manuscript in draft form, and it is masterful. Wilson explores the century-long struggle to bring a high-quality liberal arts education to all students and exposes, that's not the right word, he eviscerates the intellectual and moral evasions that have hampered that critical quest. In his book, Stephen argues that the current focus on therapeutic education and identity politics has come at the expense of academic rigor and intellectual joy, particularly for low-income students and minority students. He contends that these evasions, as he calls them, while well-intended, ultimately fail to serve the very students they aim to help. His book is a call to action, a challenge to return to what we know works in education. When the Times asked rhetorically if Stephen was dismissed over a racially dubious blog post or because he was an arrogant autocrat, let the record show that the correct answer is neither. He was fired for daring to be a voice of courage and conviction in a time when too many were afraid to speak out or were cowed into submission by what my colleagues Rick Hess and Grant Addison described 4 years ago as, quote, an incoherent, illiberal agenda and a misguided assault on the very mores and habits of mind that undergird liberty, equality, and healthy communities. It is my honor to welcome Stephen Wilson to the stage today to share his vision for bringing high expectations back to education, a vision that I know is shared by all of us, by all of our distinguished panelists who you will meet in a moment. But first, ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Wilson.
Thank you, Robert. Robert, thank you for that super generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm going to jump right in because we have to be very careful about time, assuming that this works. Yes, I would like to begin by going back a century and a quarter and just galloping through the last century because I think it's important to set the stage for what follows later. Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard, led in the late 1800s a committee of 10 to define the future of secondary education in America. at a time when very few people were going to high school. And the report argued that every student should be trained in the powers of observation, memory, expression, and reasoning, which would prepare students equally for the duties of life as for college. So this is an extraordinary statement. You'll see here that every subject, he says, which is taught at all in a secondary school should be taught in the same way and to the same extent to every student, no matter what the probable destination of the pupil may be, the career, going to college, etc. The committee was proposing a liberal arts education for all children. And at the turn of the 20th century, the ideals of a liberal education seemed to be widely held. But in 1904, the psychologist G. Stanley Hall, who was a relentless critic of this report, decried its, quote, extraordinary fallacies, especially that all students should be taught the same curriculum. He said most students were part of a great army of incapables who should be in schools for dullards or subnormal children. Eliot shot right back, though. He said the number of incapables was but an insignificant proportion of school children. Who are we to decide what each will become? Quote, who are we to make these prophecies? The new education professoriate, of course, is the answer. It was exactly that sorting that it soon proposed, and Eliot's vision of liberal education was forgotten. There's Louis Terman, a leading education psychologist and eugenicist, who in 1916 developed tests to, quote, scientifically identify a child's fixed potential. They're still for sale today, by the way. Most immigrants, he said, tested at, quote, borderline moronity and are largely uneducable. Then go forward a couple of decades and you get to the life adjustment movement that claimed that only 20% of young people were suited to academic studies. 60% should go to classes in dating and health and so on. And Life Educator decried that they were still lingering college standards in high schools. And then we come to the 1970s. Now it's no longer the schools that are sorting students because the students conveniently do it for themselves. Most students search for bargains, courses that kept them on track to graduate, but demanded little of them. But America awakened to the conditions of the schools with the bombshell 1983 report that we're also familiar with, A Nation at Risk. It found that 40% of minority youth were functionally illiterate. We have a cafeteria-style curriculum in which the appetizers and desserts can easily be mistaken for the main courses. So the educational excellence movement was born. Then came, of course, the Standards and Accountability movement, culminating in the No Child Left Behind Act. And 2 decades later, not 2 days, education reform, it is said, has failed. But I think that obscures striking successes on which we can build the next chapter of reform. The Massachusetts Miracle was a comprehensive reform act in Massachusetts, as Robert mentioned, passed in 1993. At the time, I think we were 35th in SAT scores in Massachusetts, and we then rose on the NAEP to the top, where we have remained, I say we because I used to be from Massachusetts, in every subject since then. So we have to ask, why did it work there and not other places? And I submit to you, it comes down to the shared commitments of its four architects. And you look at these guys at first, and yes, they're all white men, but this was 30 years ago. They appear to be incredibly different. Bill Weld, the Brahmin Republican governor, who ran against the entrenched state government, epitomized by Senate President Bill Bulger, who grew up in the projects of South Boston. And you have Mark Roosevelt, the House Education Chair, who ran against Weld and called him these kinds of nasty things. And then lastly, you have Thomas Birmingham, the labor lawyer and Senate Chair, who grew up in hardscrabble Chelsea, right next to Boston. But they shared something very important, which is that they had all benefited from an exceptional education. They knew the opportunities and joys it had afforded them. And maybe more importantly, they shared a revulsion at the dismal performance of the state's K-12 system. And they were determined to correct it. Weld announced shortly after the law was signed that Massachusetts would become the highest performing state in the country. And a decade later, it was. So in 2006, Fordham Foundation did a study of the state standards across the states and awarded Massachusetts the letter grade A in all subjects. This was the work of Jim Pizer, who I think is here with us. So we should acknowledge Jim's remarkable work. And Sandra Stotsky, who developed all of the individual standards and corresponding assessments and the new teacher assessments and so on. You know, we think of standards as being dry and dull and technocratic. Look at these, if you can read them, for myths in middle school. They bristle with intellectual joy. Who would not want to be that student who creates his own hero's tale with required tasks, the interventions of the gods, mythical monsters, and special clothing? That's great. That is intellectual joy. And in the first annual administration of the 10th grade exit exam, which was tied to getting a diploma, more than half of the students failed in the state. And again, the second year. But by the time the test counted, failure rates plummeted to 5%. Students rose to the occasion. They could absolutely do this. We raised the bar and they met it. It was a triumph. But there were some problems that remained. Achievement gaps remained. Urban schools have such a different charge, and we're not allowed to say this, but they do. Such a different charge from suburban schools. Their education effects have to be so much stronger. They have to be much better to achieve their purpose, which is to free students from poverty and set them on the way to college. And Weld and Bulger knew that, but they weren't able to win all the reforms necessary to make that happen. So jump forward. Here's Al Schenker, the president of AFT, who had a wonderful weekly column, I remember this from childhood, that ran each Sunday in the Times. In 1998, he devoted himself to the idea of charter schools, which was not his own, but he embraced it. And he was forthright enough to say that 80% of students were not learning. Tinkering wouldn't work. We needed wholesale reinvention led by enterprising educators. And it's not going to happen right away. A lot of the early projects, he said, were going to fail, but eventually something would work. Now, this is a classroom in a Brooklyn school in 1990. They are those occasions where words really fail and the picture is stronger. This is a picture of abject neglect. It also shows you that while gangs and crime and violence were constant threats in urban schools, the larger obstacle, the larger threat were low-level offenses. Beepers going off, desks turned over, singing, rude remarks. This was misery for students to remain in such a classroom for an entire year. And the schools that did succeed came to be known as no excuses schools, not contrary to popular perception, because they were unforgiving of student behavior, but because they said, we as adults, as professionals, are not going to make excuses for why students aren't learning. These were schools that were obsessed with the quality of teaching and instruction. They wouldn't make excuses by blaming families, not having enough money, racism, poverty, a litany of explanation that schools and districts had invoked for decades in defense of low achievement. They said, and this is bracing, within these four walls, we have everything we need to succeed with every child. We will do whatever it takes to succeed. It wasn't going to be one thing. There wasn't one thing. It was what we call the 1% solutions that added up to success. You had to attend to each one. And if you did, you would end up with a gap-closing school. Brookings called these effects some of the largest effects ever observed in an educational study. And Mackie Raymond's Center for Research on Education Outcomes, CREDO, released just last year its third national study, 1.8 million students, and it found that in New York City, if you were in a CMO and Network 1 school, your instruction was so accelerated that you would gain the equivalent of 124 days of additional instruction in math each year and 110 days in reading versus the average school of 180 days. And it wasn't just a few schools here and there. There were now thousands, she reported, that were successfully closing these gaps. The model was successfully scaling, and the report lists them, pages like this one, pages after pages of networks that were killing it. These organizations together were creating 50,000 new seats a year, equivalent to opening a district the size of Boston. Now look, they were far from perfect. One thing that was a definite struggle was that teachers had to inhabit that very difficult space of what we called warm strict, warmth to students, but also an orderly and strict environment. That was a hard place to stay in, and when teachers screwed up and acted from power and not purpose, they wronged their students and betrayed their school's mission. But the successes are extraordinary. But then came a new generation of aspiring teachers that are graduating from colleges with totally different commitments from those of a decade earlier. And they brought these values to their schools, to their charter and district schools. At many universities and colleges, liberal education's traditional commitments were losing their authority. Unwelcome speech was now violence, and an intolerant orthodoxy had taken hold. Michel Foucault's ideas on power and knowledge were the currency and remain the currency in all of their different postmodernist adaptations of the humanities and social sciences. And in that posture, truth is a phantasm. There is only power. Objectivity and reason are merely instruments of the oppressor. There is but my truth and your truth, and each of us is forever isolated by our identities. At schools of education, meanwhile, the dominant text, the one that was most often assigned, was Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that describes the banking model of education, which he condemns as making deposits of oppressor knowledge into his students. And in his critical pedagogy, students will be awakened to their oppression and join in an overthrow of society which he expected to be violent. It's a profoundly anti-intellectual work, and it substitutes political indoctrination for academic learning. In 2020, the murder of George Floyd by the police led to a national revulsion and the largest protest in American history in the midst of the pandemic. The racial reckoning that followed could have spurred on this transition, this transformation of urban education in a drive for educational equity. It could have insisted that we only place before students worthwhile tasks that are elevated and rigorous and engaging, and that had high expectations of what every child could know and do. But that's not what happened. Instead of spurring on this transformation, it arrested it. An array of new conceptions rooted in critical theory, trauma-informed pedagogy, a culture of student fragility, racial essentialism, overtook the sector. And it was in schools and districts that we saw a radical critique of schools and society which emphasized racial harm and healing, and education was neglected. We know that Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi's books became bestsellers nationally and had a particularly large following on campus, and institutions, district schools rushed to declare themselves anti-racist and join in a program of diversity, equity, inclusion. But the most common text, and this may be less known, was written by Tima Okum and is used in virtually every anti-racist training of school and staff. Here's an illustration of it. It's actually, the written version is not a whole lot longer than this. Teachers and leaders learned that objectivity and urgency were symptoms of toxic white supremacy culture, which is signified by the vials of toxins, in case you missed it. It's hard to conjure a more harmful message to children than to say that objectivity or love of the written word is whiteness. And this launched an ideological purity spiral in many schools and networks where the professional culture turned rancorous, longstanding colleagues turned on one another with vicious accusations of racism, and the focus on the mission, which was to educate, was lost. Here's a school, Boston Collegiate, a total high flyer. 100% of its graduates have been accepted to four-year colleges since, I think, 2004. 80% go on to graduate. Look at the results in 2019. Way outperforming in math on the MCAS, the Boston Public Schools, and even the statewide average. And same in math, an equally striking performance. But in 2019, the school hired a director of DEI. She identified 4 areas of growth for the school staff, and they're shown here: misogynoir, trauma-informed practice, colorism, and internalized dominance and oppression. Each staff member was assigned one of these to work on. They had a buddy who would monitor them, and so on and so forth. Affinity groups, the history curriculum was decolonized, disciplinary practices were overhauled, and 5th and 6th graders had to examine the intersection of 10 different identity groups. Here are the results after the intervention. The results sank. Now they were not only below the state, but they were below the Boston Public Schools. In charter world, the definition of mediocrity is that you do a little better than the district. And in math, also a dramatic tumble. Or consider Noble, a network of 17 high schools in Chicago. In 2015, 1 of every 10 students in Chicago went to a Noble school. And in 2019, 10 of the top 12 slots in the city for high schools were held by Noble schools. Here are the results in 2017. You can see the SAT results in math and in ELA, strikingly outperforming the city schools. Director of DEI was hired, a DEI firm was engaged, and the new CEO announced that the network would become anti-racist. It's chaos now, one Noble student said. I don't think they should have changed the rules, honestly, because there's ruckus everywhere, another said. Discipline collapsed, tardies skyrocketed, violence grew, and results collapsed. Yes, I hear some gasps. It's astounding. 4% in math and ELA. BES, a wonderful organization, formerly known as Building Excellent Schools, trains aspiring charter school founders by visiting dozens of exemplary schools. One former BS fellow founded classical schools in New York. It's the highest performing charter network in the city. It now even outperforms the Extraordinary Success Academy schools. Here are its results. But after declaring itself anti-racist, the DEI consultant proposed not that they visit classical schools, but that they go to something called Roses in Concrete Charter School in Oakland, California, which adhered to Freire's liberatory learning philosophy. That year, California found that only 17% of students in that school were proficient in ELA and 6% in math. It wasn't just a bad school, it was one of the very worst in the state. And months later, the Oakland School Board refused to renew its charter. I think we mock students when we claim to empower them when denying them the tools of influence. And these are not isolated incidents. In 2019, Oakland's document was the centerpiece of a mandatory training for all New York City administrators, together responsible for educating 1 million kids. So what began to happen is that instead of starting with education, educators instead focused, as Robert alluded to, on trauma. Everyone was assumed to have suffered from trauma, and the first obligation was to heal the students. Well, first to heal the staff. So there was this solipsistic aspect of this. And then after that, to heal the students. And only then would we get around to actually educating kids. And districts and students were urged to lessen their academic expectations, relaxing lesson rigor, easing standards, lessening homework. The savage disparities of race and class worsened, and students' prospects on graduation dimmed. So in here, really, we have what becomes an inexhaustible excuse. Because right in the past, we said in no excuses schooling that we would not make excuses for low outcomes. But the pledge has been revoked because racism is pervasive, it's virulent, it is everywhere. But we can't wait until we have vanquished racism to fix the schools. We have to act now. And we can see how that plays out. In 1848, Horace Mann, the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, said in this well-known quote that education is the great equalizer of the conditions of men. But now Massachusetts Teachers Association President Mary Najami says, MCAS scores mostly measure the impact of structural racism. So I think of this as an abdication. She's apparently given up on her schools and her students, but we haven't and we won't. Social justice is not the long-awaited correction to America's procession of exclusionary anti-intellectual school reforms. It is its apotheosis. It will leave students that it aims to help less educated, more excluded, and more vulnerable. And I know that there are folks that want to try to be able to join these things. Can't we just put them together, take no excuses and combine it with social justice education? But if you look at this chart, I think you'll see that they're fundamentally opposed, and that can't be done. So we've lost 4 years. It's time to change course, and I think offer every student that engaging liberal arts education, an education that arouses curiosity, cultivates compassion, and upholds reason. Let's establish a new ethics of care in education that says, we've only met this standard of care if instruction is demonstrably effective. Let's double down on urban charter schools, the most successful intervention of the past century, and not get distracted by new fads, which is always happening in education. Let's venerate knowledge. The achievement of humankind across all cultures belongs to our students. Schools will celebrate and build student knowledge, not disdain it. Let's build schools powered by curiosity, that great untapped resource in schools today. And let's create optimists, students who have the skills, agency, and optimism to succeed personally, but also to contribute to solving the problems their generation will inherit. And let's welcome a new generation of firebrands who will bring the furious energy and famous impatience that Linda Brown, who we recently lost, was known for. They'll get to work and they'll be formidable. And I explore these ideas further in my new book, as Robert mentioned. Thank you very much.
Stay up there. I'd like to welcome to the stage now Stephanie Sirocchi de Garcia and Doug Lamov, along with Stephen Wilson. Stephen, that was infuriating for all the right reasons. More on that in a moment. Let me introduce our two new guests. Stephanie Sirocchi de Garcia is the co-founder of Seton Education Partners, which launches and operates networks of public charter and Catholic schools in underserved communities across 3 states. Her work focuses on providing academically rigorous and character-rich educational opportunities or options for parents, targeting communities where Catholic schools have shuttered. Her career reflects a deep commitment to educational equity and excellence and includes teaching high school English as a Teach for America Corps member in Oakland, California, and launching and leading the Philanthropy Roundtable's K-12 education programs. She further honed her policy expertise at the Office of Management and Budget and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Doug Lamov, to my immediate right, is a renowned figure in the education world. He rose to prominence with his book, Teach Like a Champion, now in its third edition, which outlines practical techniques and strategies gleaned from successful teachers, aiming to enhance teacher effectiveness and ultimately improve student outcomes. Lamov's work directly connects to the concept of restoring high expectations in education, to the degree to which there's a playbook common to all high-achieving or no-excuses charter schools of the past 2 decades. Doug Lamov literally wrote the book. I'll come back to that in a second, but Stephen, when I just said I was infuriated, I mean it earnestly, so I'm just going to start with you. I've commented previously and elsewhere that there's probably no field like education in terms of just being unaware of its own history, and you just put that on display for us. What in God's name is it going to take for us to remember that we have been through this before, answered it satisfactorily in the case of urban charters for the last quarter century, and then simply forgot it? Why does this keep happening?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer. I think you're absolutely right that there's this ceaseless quest for the new shiny thing. There is no sense of what has preceded us and what was tried and worked and what didn't work. That is an immense problem. We're fundamentally incurious about the past and about the history of education reform. But I also think, and Robert, you've written about this, I think we have lost our moral way. We have stopped, and so if I sounded a bit moralizing, forgive me, but I do interpret this history a bit at this level. We have an obligation to the students that we serve, and I think that we were ill-advised by a lot of communications firms for the last 15, 20 years to make nice and to keep our mouths closed and engage in anodyne banalities like a school that's right for every child, instead of pointing out, hey, we're doing this, right, because the schools don't work. That's why we're here. And once we stopped saying that, we deprived ourselves of a case for the work we do.
Doug, I want to throw it to you right away because I mean it earnestly. You really are the author of so much of what happens or has happened inside of so-called no excuses schools, which is, as Stephen noticed, by the way, I'm perhaps one of the last people that is comfortable with that nomenclature because I remember what it meant,
yes.
Which is there's no excuses for us as educators. When children fail, we fail children. So Doug, I'd just love to hear your thoughts about this kind of intersection between social justice and the broader goals of education that I think we are all committed to.
Yeah, so much of it is about control of language. I think the term no excuses is a classic case of that term has been won. It went from meaning the adults would not make excuses for not doing right by not taking the responsibility for students, and now it's become co-opted to mean some sort of a misappropriation of authority on the parts of adults.
It became code for harsh discipline.
Yes, exactly. The apotheosis of that, when you share that data, I have been in that school, not the exact schools that you share data on, but I've been in that school 100 times this year, in the last year and a half. Once great schools, once very good schools. I'm thinking in particular of a school that I visited about a year ago. This is a high-performing charter in a small industrial city in the Northeast, where if you were a parent in that city, this was the one school that you could send your kid to and know that their learning time would be respected and that they would be safe as a starting point and that someone would take their education very, very seriously. I went back to that school in November and it was, utter chaos, just no learning happening. And the adults said two things that were really telling to me. One of the things that the head of school said was, just not really sure that adults should be telling young people what to do. How have we gotten to that place where we no longer believe that it is an adult's role to shape a student's experience in life? The second thing that they said was that they were busy dismantling systems of oppression in the school, by which I think they meant things like kids having to line up to, occasionally to go places and to be silent in the hallways and that sort of thing. And my take was, whatever systems of oppression you think you're dismantling, they are a lot less oppressive than the chaos that is going on in the school right now, and you should reassemble them as quickly as you can. And I also think there's a mistake there that schools have led themselves to believe that students are the client, that making students happy is the purpose of school. And it's very easy to manipulate students to believe what makes them happy and what serves their interest. The client is the parent, the person who sends their child to their school, hoping that you will prepare them for success and achievement and to accomplish their dreams in life. And parents know, most parents, that your job is not to make kids happy. If they ask you for ice cream for dinner, you say no, right? You say there's, to care about someone is to have high expectations for them. And I think you're unfortunately quite right that has been lost, and it is a long way back. When you say more seats in high-performing urban charter schools, my biggest fear is that there is a long way back to even having those
Can I just
schools.
say,
Yeah,
Doug, that
yeah, it's a long way.
that CREDA report, the study period was 2015 to 2019.
It's a long time ago.
So imagine if it were just bumped up a few years. I can't resist just saying one thing following what you said, which is that rooms that are disorderly, chaotic, and where instruction is not effective are miserable places to be.
For teachers and for students.
For
Yes.
both. Total misery, torture. And to imagine sitting in one of those rooms. I mean, I remember, of course, touring classrooms in our own networks. When you went into a room that was working, the kids were joyful, they were learning, they were feeling successful. You wanted to sit in the back of the room to the end of the day.
Yeah.
Instead, you were brought into another room, and if it was off the hook and not functioning, it was agony to remain there. I think we forget that.
And young people, they're not only happy when they're learning, but they understand that people who hold them to high expectations care about them.
Exactly.
Right? They get that very quickly. It's why they feel such commitment to their extracurricular activities, like the drama program or sports, where they get that adults who care about them hold them to high expectations. And somehow educators in the classroom have lost sight of the fact that that includes them as well.
Stephanie, a few years ago, when all of this sort of social justice education was kind of at a hot boil, you had the courage to say something at a Manhattan Institute convening that I have quoted countless times since then, and I've got the quote here. You said, "We have not had a single one of our parents saying, 'We want you to do more of this anti-racist work.'" What you said from memory was that they wanted classical education, they wanted order, they wanted uniforms, they wanted their kids to go to college. So that was about 4 or 5 years ago. Just so we can level set, has that changed?
It has definitely not changed. We serve nearly 3,000 children. We serve 2,000 children in the Bronx. And we actually, in our charter application, said that parents are the primary educators of their children and that we would honor parents as the primary educators of their children. And our parents want safety. They want to be given respect as parents. They want their children to have better opportunities than they had. And the push for anti-racism comes, I think, from two places. One, teachers who care deeply about children, and two, from funders, who at one point were really focused on academic results and cared about those. And there has been a pivot in the funding community.
To tell a story about that remark, I wrote about your comment at the time, and I called the leader of a well-known charter school network, which I will not name, who had been very vocal on social media about the need to do anti-racist work, to teach for social justice. And as a former journalist, to be blunt, I was playing dial-a-quote. I knew what this person was going to say. Oh, no, Stephanie's wrong. We're deeply committed to this. He shocked the heck out of me by saying, "Oh, no, she's right. We're not hearing it either." And my response was, "Dude, then why are you out there saying all these things?" And he said more or less what you said. It's our alumni, the young alumni who they've sent to college, and it's the young teachers. So here's my question. Is this what's the analogy? Not a Gordian knot. But is this going to be difficult to unwind because you've got charter schools tend to rely on each successive generation of young teachers coming in to staff these schools? If the people we need to hire have been steeped in this ideology, does that kind of put charter leaders on the horns of a dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this question of the foundations is just huge. The same DEI firms that I mentioned, but not by name, are also working extensively with all the major funders. So the Walton Foundation, Gates Foundation, everywhere you look, have been captured and taken over by these beliefs. So that is an immense issue.
I mean, the important thing to remember is that the frame for children and the adults they serve has to be about hope, and it has to be about agency. And we teach our children that every human being has inherent dignity. That what makes us different as human beings is we have reason and we have free will. We call it free choice. And that we're called to use those two gifts to make the most excellent choices. And we hold our children and help them to make excellent choices. And the anti-racist framework really undermines both hope and agency.
But is there a steelman argument to be made here? I mean, I know, Stephen, in one of your last slides, you said they were irreconcilable. But is there a fair way to say, look, you can really have high expectations, be academically rigorous, and still teach for social justice?
Well, I think that the purest form of social justice is what we all thought we were doing, which was to educate students. Because to achieve social justice, we have to have a path to college for students who want to go to college. It's $1 million of additional income in a lifetime. That's the most crassest instrumental view of it. Of course, the benefits are infinite. And this is just critically important that we understand that we have to offer this pathway if we want to empower students. So that's the first thing, I think, is to recognize that social justice is an education. There's no agency without an education. And if we want to empower students, we have to give them the ability, we have to give them the tools that powerful people have, the ability to reason, to express themselves clearly, orally, and in writing, to be able to understand the views of someone with whom they might disagree, and to have a spirited conversation, all those things. We are not empowering students by telling them what to believe. And if you go into classrooms where this kind of social justice education is taking place, what you see is that students are sullen, depressed, angry, because they're not experiencing academic success. They're deprived of a sense of agency, and they feel like society is victimizing them, which of course to some degree is true. But those are the messages that are constantly reinforced. So there's no empowerment there. And then if you go to the school next door, which is intellectually vibrant, believes in its kids, has lofty expectations, what you will see is a really joyful place where children feel powerful.
Can I please throw a teaspoon of optimism into the proceedings?
I hope someone will.
Only a teaspoon, but a teaspoon nonetheless. I was recently in England, and I think it's really important that we recognize the different trajectory of schooling in England and in the US. The most recent round of TIMSS data came out today. US TIMSS scores have gone down precipitously in all subject areas. England continues to rise, despite the pandemic, despite a very similar culture, despite even like they're importing many of our ideological beliefs about social justice to England. Those things are quite real in England. And yet their schools are dramatically on the rise. I recently spent 18 months working with a group of schools outside Birmingham, which is, Birmingham is one of the most economically deprived parts of England. These two areas outside of Birmingham, Walsall and Sandwell, are where I'm working with a program. It's 18 months funded by the government of very technical pedagogical training for teachers in the schools. Spent 18 months training them, training the leadership, giving them rich PD. It includes both pre and post visits, and those schools at the end of this 18 months were so much better than they were 18 months ago. And the provision of education was so not just quality teaching, but happy, thriving students in what people would say are the most economically deprived neighborhoods in Birmingham. So I walked out of that feeling both like optimistic and depressed at the same time. Be optimistic because it's possible, right? Dramatic change in 18 months, and a little bit depressed because my first thought was that would never happen in the United States. What's the difference?
Thank you.
A couple of things. I think one, that In the UK, a head teacher said to me, you almost can't meet an NQT, newly qualified teacher, who has been to a training program where they don't talk about the importance of cognitive load theory, of understanding retrieval practice, of understanding the role of knowledge in reading comprehension. So they have broken the cartel of ideology that shapes teacher training and replaced it with a sector-wide faith in and belief in cognitive science, right? So people make decisions, they can see learning, or they can understand the things that are likely to cause learning to happen. If you can't see those things, of course you replace them with a cheap proxy. I think there's a difference in what people think it means to work for an institution in England. I think when people in England work for a school and the school says, this is what we're going to do, these are our initiatives, we're going to try them, they think it's their obligation to actually to do those things. And I think in a lot of the US, people perceive themselves as warriors on behalf of, they're on a moral crusade. And if the school says to do something that they're not sure that they believe in, they kind of think it's their obligation not to do with the school. So I think a lot of this has to do with schools that over time build a culture. A lot of this is around the role of unions in schools. But if you can't cause people to get to do things in a school and follow through, you get cultures of intransigence. I think there is less confusion about the crucial difference between authority and authoritarianism in England. They are very comfortable with the idea that like you are an adult, you're in charge of the room, and it should not be violent, and it should not be disrupted, and it should be safe. I think in the US, people have lost that definition, and any exercise of authority appears to them to be authoritarian. And the last thing I would say, that assessment is very different in the UK. You take your GCSEs, you are accountable for your GCSE results as a student. They're in every subject area, which reinforces the idea of a rich knowledge-driven curriculum that takes students seriously. And when students are taken seriously in the classroom, they feel the difference. Those 4 or 5 things, I think, have been profound difference makers. England has been like the success of Western societies and their educational system. They have a very similar culture to us, and those are, I think, achievable public policy initiatives that could change the trajectory of our schools.
We had Nick Gibb, the former education,
Brilliant.
on this stage.
If there's one person who gets credit for all that, it's Nick
Gibb.
Yeah.
So we discussed some of this, but my question for you is the same question that I had for him. How much of this is national culture? How much of it is teaching or educational culture?
Plenty of both.
Okay.
I mean, I think they work. I think the interesting thing is that I think a lot of people know that it's not. I think there's an illusion of consensus. People are afraid to speak up and say this really isn't working because it's risky to speak up. But I think a lot of people know that it's not working inside schools.
Okay, apropos of what's not working, I have a pet theory about how we lost our way, which I'd love to run by each of you. And it's also predicated on a conversation that occurred on this very stage even before I worked at AI. I was a panelist. We had the new head of Teach for America at the time, and she was describing TFA's shift to be more, they didn't use the term anti-racist, but to teach for social justice. And I remember her saying that we're having a difficult time overcoming structural racism. And it sounded for all the world like listening to, say, a Diane Ravitch or a Richard Rothstein 10 or 15 years ago saying, look, if you want to fix schools, you got to fix poverty. And it sounded to my ears, and I challenged her in this, it sounds to me like you're saying if we want to fix schools, we have to fix racism. And she, of course, denied that. But here's what I wonder. Stephen, with the exception of some urban charter schools, right, it's fairly common knowledge that charters as a whole have not necessarily outperformed district schools. And if we look at the ed reform movement as a whole over 30 years, we don't really have a lot to show for ourselves, right? NAEP scores have been more or less flat. So what I've always wondered is if we were not ripe for the picking, so to speak, because we failed as education reformers, and we needed an explanation for why we failed. And the explanation couldn't be, well, our incompetence, because we're all the best and brightest. So it must be some other force that we are powerless to control. Oh, it must be structural racism.
Well, I would go even further than that and say that I think that there is an element of nihilism at play in this. And I think that there is a sense of defeatism that is leading to some of the more extreme dimensions of social justice education. The idea that in some utopian future, merit won't matter. You won't have to have conventional academic training. That there will be this utopian world where these things won't be required. And I think it's a very dangerous and, of course, in some ways, silly conception, because it's not going to happen. And what we need to do is to prepare students for the world as it is, and to survive and potentially thrive in the world as it is. You have to be good at something. You have to find your gifts and develop them, and all the rules still apply. But so I'm saying that I sense in some of this ideology a desire to kind of create a new playing field where the majority culture rules don't apply. And I think that that is a form of giving up. And I think it's tremendously sad, because there's no reason to give up at all. Students of every background and income, we know, can thrive, because in the schools that are working, we're proving it and reproving it every day. And I would just like to invite everyone over to that project, because that we can do.
Stephanie, Stephen criticizes the idea that certain pedagogical approaches, like emphasizing the written word, for example, are indicative of white supremacy culture. Have you seen some of those tensions at work in your work at Seton with young staff who might find the arguments of a Kendi or a D'Angelo compelling and persuasive?
Yeah, and I think that this started before the murder of George Floyd. And I remember seeing a proposed PD for teachers that included microaggressions. And I said, like, this is not going to be helpful to the culture of the school, and it's not focused on actually helping children to achieve and succeed. And there's limited time in schools, in the school day. If you're going to do PD, it has to be focused on how to become an excellent instructor. So I think that this happened prior to, this started happening many years ago.
Am I remembering this story correctly, that you said, yes, you can do the PD, but you can't use any text by authors that are not in the classical canon?
I challenge them to use, so let me just say that our schools are classically inspired, and by inspired, our children read the Odyssey, and they also read Esperanza Rising. And so they are a broader tent. But in that particular instance, my challenge was, there are plenty of texts before the 1900s that deal with issues of race. And if you're going to have that conversation with teachers, model a great Socratic dialogue that they can then use with the children that they're serving. But my worry was that this was going to be divisive, not unifying, and it was going to move the needle away from what really matters, which is moving children forward academically.
We're going to go to audience questions in a short amount of time, and I've been remiss in not giving out the hashtag, which is hashtag AEI standards for those who are following online. So within a few minutes, we'll take some of those questions. Doug, I found myself over the years, the last couple of years, getting angry on your behalf. And I hope I'm not putting you on the spot by saying this, because I meant what I said before earnestly, that this entire sector of schools really is, in a sense, you're the author of what happens in a lot of these schools. And yet for a while I was seeing your work described as carceral pedagogy, and practice for prison and whatnot.
I've heard that term, carceral pedagogy.
Right, which I'm not sure what it means. I can infer what it means. Again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I found myself, again, getting angry on your behalf. Like, all this guy has done is set untold tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of disadvantaged kids on a path to college. I just want to give you a couple of minutes to see if you're willing or interested in responding to that characterization of your work.
Well, I mean, obviously, I think it's a massive mischaracterization. And I think it's the kind of thing that people do when they, what does Mary Wollstonecraft say? Very few people choose evil for its own sake. They mistake it for the good they seek. That people say that because they are asked to do something incredibly difficult when they are asked to build high achieving classrooms, but build high achieving classrooms that reverse the equation of inequality. Like that's a really, really hard thing to do, and it's scary, and most people fail at it. And when you give smart people the option of doing that, or doing something that can make them feel instantly successful and valid and kind of affirm their membership in a group of people, would most people choose to go to a cocktail party and be lauded and approved by their peers at the cocktail party for doing great and moral work with young people, even if that work with young people didn't actually change their circumstances in life? Or would they rather do work that really changes young people's circumstances in life and have people at the cocktail party wonder about their moral stature for doing it? Very few people have the courage to do B. Most people choose A. It's easier, and in the end, people are motivated by their desire to feel a connection with ideological peers, or with what they perceive to be their membership group. I think the first step is for us just to have the courage and coherence to say, that is not the model. I had to explain to my children what carceral pedagogy meant and why people said that about me online. Why people, Dad, why do people say these things about you? But they got it pretty quickly. And I think once you have exposed the myth, it's not as scary anymore. People can say what they want. And I think that Stephen has really laid down a very clear charge for us here, which is there is an immense opportunity that is at risk for thousands and thousands of young people who we are on the brink of serving better and on the brink of creating a truly meritocratic society for them, and that is slipping away. And I think there are enough of us who see that we can stick together and affirm each other and start the work of rebuilding what we started.
Excellent. So how are we going to do that? What's the next step?
I think why do people get so persuaded by I think we talk a lot about the influence of social media on young people, profoundly important. We don't talk enough about the influence of social media on adults. It shapes all of our worldview. The medium is the message. It's very easy to assemble an ideological thought bubble that echo chamber that you live inside of. One of the reasons why people are so persuaded by that, though, is they are part of institutions that they don't feel a connection to. They don't feel decline of faith in institutions is one of the most profound trends in American society in the last 20 years. People no longer believe that the institutions that they are part of or that serve them are effective and useful. And as Yuval Levin has written about, people often see those institutions now as platforms for their own expression of ideology and beliefs. That starts with organizational ineffectiveness. When you're not good at teaching reading, when you're not successful, when you don't run a great school, of course people don't believe in the school. The most important people we need to have faith in institutions are the employees of those, are the stakeholders in that institution. So for me, it starts with where we started before 20 years ago. We've lost a lot of that work, but school by school, reducing the barriers to people being able to start great schools, and creating incentives for great schools, and then school by school starting great schools, and creating existence proof. I think Stephanie, you told a great story about a journalist who came to your schools, and it was from a publication maybe where you weren't expecting generous treatment.
Yeah, the New Yorker.
But when they came to the school and they saw it they saw it in action, and they saw what it looked like, and they saw how happy and how thriving the children were, that changes people's minds. And I just think the only way to do it is school by school. Great school, start with 3, and then the next year will be 5, and the next year will be 35.
Although I'm troubled by the story you told earlier, Doug, about the school where there was chaos.
Yeah.
Because if I'm remembering correctly...
There are a lot of those schools that I've seen this year.
25, 30 years ago, the whole no excuses movement was a direct response to that chaos. Yeah. Nobody can learn in these conditions. But now, if I'm understanding you correctly, we're hearing of schools valorizing those conditions. Or am I misinterpreting?
Or
I think that's, if I may,
Yeah,
I don't think
please.
they're valorizing them. I think that they recognize
Excusing them.
they're excusing them. And weirdly, and I didn't include this, many of the instigators of the interventions are claiming that they're publicly claiming that they're successful. I mean, it's deeply odd. They'll go and say that we've turned it around. Meanwhile, it's totally broken. This can't last. I mean, yes, this stuff is fairly deeply institutionalized in districts and schools, but it's also very plainly not working. And I think there's a growing public awareness across ideological bubbles that this kind of ideology is absent, is broken. That creates an opportunity. And so it'd be fun to discuss about how do we then re-spark activity. I do think we need, as my last slide said, a new generation of firebrands. We do need people like Eva Moscovich, who is willing to stand up and say definitively what she stands for, what you do and what you do, Doug. I mean, this is what has to happen. We have to create a setting where people feel secure and emboldened to step forward. Now, how we make that happen, I'm less clear on. But I think there's a lot of intellectual work to be done at this moment. We have to remake our case in stark terms. We've been cowering, and we need to stop cowering.
I hate to be the skunk at the picnic. However, I was speaking just this week with a charter leader in a large US city who said they're having a difficult time attracting what you just described as the next generation of firebrands. That school leaders who in a previous time might have been attracted to this work no longer are attracted to this work.
Right, and that's because we've let the critics of charter schools attack charters as the billionaire boys club, so on in the case of Diane Ravitch with the fury of the apostate. And that's what has consumed the airtime. And meanwhile, we haven't responded, I think. Partly because, as I said, we've been advised not to. I think it was a terrible mistake. Instead, we need to, in a respectful way, we need to respond. And because otherwise, what students know on graduating from college is that we're the bad guys. We were the good guys to a generation before, but we're now the bad guys. So if you talk to the high-flying Boston charters and you ask them about this, they will say they have a hard time recruiting teachers because the teachers have moral qualms that they're engaging in something that is bad. We have to fight back against that. We have to reposition what we do.
We're sitting in a policy institution. I mean, I completely agree with you that we need to sell these ideas to the next generation of teachers and kind of have the good ideas push out the bad. Is there a policy play here to revive the charter sector?
One of the first things I would want to do is I think there is a cartel for education, for certification and preparation of teachers. And that cartel lead is highly ideological. One of the most important things that happened in England that changed the foundation of what teachers thought and believed was policy changes that allowed operating organizations to certify and train their own teachers, basically, so that they didn't have to go through schools of education, and so that early teacher training could be aligned towards what makes people successful. The other thing that makes teachers amenable or suggestible to broken ideologies is they are not successful in the classroom. You're getting beaten up every day, you know you're not successful, and so now you're looking for reasons to explain it, and you're looking for other things to believe in. But if I can get you for the first year of your career and help you give really clear directions to students so it's clear what you expect of them, and then with a smile you can tell them, thank you, Jason, thank you, Jose, thank you, Carla, right? So that they know that I see whether they follow through, and suddenly students are following directions in my classroom. If I can teach a teacher to be successful in the classroom, they are much more likely to be focused on the craft of teaching and much less likely to be amenable to ideological persuasion. So maybe the first step would be allowing schools that believe in this vision of like to love students is to hold them to high expectations, to love students is to teach them well, let them train their own teachers and certify their own teachers.
That resonates with me so much as a former public school 5th grade teacher. There's nothing that feels better than that connection with kids when it happens.
When you know you're winning, no one is going to talk you out of.
And this also connects through to what I describe as the therapeutic evasion, right? One of the several ways in which we depart from doing the work that we need to do, which is teaching kids, is that in the therapeutic evasion, educators mistakenly assume that they need to tend to the therapeutic needs of their students. Because if students feel better about themselves, they will then learn better. And the causality, and there's substantial research on this, really runs much more strongly in the other direction. If students have frequent experiences of success, they feel great about themselves. And they're much too smart to be condescended to by teachers telling them they're great, when in fact they know that their skill level is very low. And the epitome of this was the self-esteem movement of the early 1990s. California declared that it had to be implemented in every school. It was a total failure, and it turned out to be based on a fraudulent set of research. But the idea was that we would work to persuade students that they are terrific and should feel good about themselves, and then learning results would follow. It's really the other way around.
Stephanie, how have you managed to resist these trends at Seton?
We're really clear about who we are and what we believe in. And so
As part of the recruitment process.
as part of the recruitment process. And we just become very explicit about our values, our mission, and we want people to select out if they don't align.
Choice is as important for teachers as it is for parents and students. Can I say, most American schools are a muddy mix of philosophies and beliefs because I can't select teachers for their alignment to a set of principles. So I can't really operate on it. But if I can say, this is what we believe in, right? If all schools could do this, this is what we believe in, this is what we think works. We actually think that the written word is not a fetish, but the written word is actually a really critical tool towards creating desirable difficulty, that it causes students to encode things in memory and remember them better and articulate their own beliefs. And so we want to do writing in every classroom every day. Like, that would be a really powerful belief. If I can select teachers for that, then I can test it, and 5 years later, I can have a demonstrably effective school, and people can say, wow, what are you doing that's so different? And I can say, writing. But right now, for 90-some% of American schools, they can't even, we never learn, we just argue, because they can't test an idea, because they can't select teachers based on alignment around a set of beliefs. I think that people focus on choice from the parent perspective. It's very important from a parent perspective. It's almost as important from a teacher perspective. I think that's what you're describing, which is we're selecting people who believe in what we're trying to do.
And just to this question of having a clear belief system that everyone in the building subscribes to, like what you're describing in your own schools. I mean, if you look at the few schools in the Boston charter sector that I was mentioning that have stayed with very high results, they're schools like the Brook charter schools, where the co-founders are still there, and they are just rock solid on their beliefs, their academic beliefs, and the kids are just soaring.
Let's go to questions. And by the way, I'm not being rude checking my phone. I'm getting questions from our online audience here, just to be clear. We'll take a few of those online questions in a moment. But first, let's, do we have a microphone? Or? And just do me the kindness of telling us your name.
Sure. My name is Mark Nadell. I'm not affiliated with anyone. My question is, when you present this data, particularly Boston Collegiate and BESS, to the funders, the foundations that are funding all of this, or the teachers' colleges, it seems the data is clear. It's not working. The scientific method, you try something, it didn't work. You said that schools that stuck with the old way, it did work. So it would seem they have an obligation to respond in some way, and I'm curious what they would say to you when you give this presentation to them. Because maybe I'm naive, but I had assumed that the DEI the slide you showed with the column of DEI, that it was more diversity for English, more diversity of sources, and for social studies, a little deeper understanding of racism in the country that had been neglected, and a little more sensitivity to students, but that math and science in particular would not be affected. When we added girls' athletics, that didn't reduce test scores for math, science, math or English. Do you know what they would say to you?
I'm just as curious what they would say as you are. I think you have to remember this was an extraordinary ideological moment in circa 2019, 2020. We've kind of forgotten about it. But there was a moral panic of a sort. And people were terrified of saying the wrong thing, of being ostracized, shamed, ultimately canceled. These were very real phenomena. And it didn't have to happen to a lot of people. You were on notice if someone saw it. And so I think that the foundations and the funders that is so important to all of this made a choice. They decided to embrace this approach. They're in it deep. It's clearly not working, and it'll be enormously interesting to see how they respond.
They believe in the scientific method, hopefully.
Well, they certainly don't want to be in the position of running and funding low-performing schools. So will they make a forceful intervention? I think they will.
Michael Petrilli, who I'm pleased to introduce as a co-presenter of today's event.
Thank you, Robert. All right, let me provide a tablespoon of optimism, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong about it. First, on the NAEP scores, let's say from the 90s until 2010, we made enormous progress, especially in math, especially for the youngest students, the lowest performing students, Black, Hispanic. I mean, like 2 grade levels of progress. So there was enormous progress once upon a time. What about the argument that says all this that you've described happened, but it was mostly concentrated in a few of the big cities on the coast, maybe Chicago. It largely passed over the Midwest, the South, and it is largely in the rearview mirror now. You know, the peak woke crested in 2020, and now it's receding. True, false, do we know?
I think it's partly true, Mike. I think that you're right, that they're really important parts of the country, the South for the most part, where this did not happen, at least not to the same degree. I think it's also true that people say that peak woke, I don't like using that term because it's a pejorative, has passed. But I don't think we should underestimate how deeply institutionalized these beliefs and practices are in schools and districts and also in unions and funders. And dislodging that, I think, is going to take a long time. That's why I say a lost decade. It's because the dislodging and the turning away that we've just started to talk about is going to take a long time.
I'm surprised, Steve, you didn't mention in your presentation the decision to eliminate the MCAS in Massachusetts.
Yeah, well, I had only so much time. I was afraid that this guy over there was going to be looking at me. But yeah, it is worth mentioning that Massachusetts, the high flyer, and it's a kind of terrible omission on my part, has been dismantled through a succession of about 5 different actions, most recently eliminating the MCAS test for the diploma.
Who is it that I think?
And so there you have, Mike, an extraordinary success, and yet it has not been sustained. That's incredible.
I was mentioning it because there's some sort of tech guru who says advances in execution are almost always preceded by advances in measurement. Right? And the first step is we can only have these arguments about the scientific method if we're actually able to look at what's happening in schools. I don't think it's a coincidence that, yes, the movement was asymmetrical and focused on urban cities is probably where we had the best and most reliable data. I think one of the first steps is to make sure that we have measurement infrastructure so that we can continue to look at quality.
Mike, just for what it's worth, Texas, Ohio, very different scenarios for us than New York City.
Here's a question from our online audience. Would you say the core issue with social justice education is the curricular content, the professional development, the underlying victimology, or all of the above?
All of the above.
I might add to that the distraction, right? The most important thing we can be doing in schools if we love and care about children and want them and want the best for all children is like, let's start with reading. And every time we're in a we're in a PD session and we're talking about microaggressions, we are not talking about reading and math and science and history, and those are the most important things.
You know, and I just want to say that I think that there is good that has come from this as well, and I don't we shouldn't overlook it. So, the CMO sector was guilty of some important failings, myself included. One of them was disparities in promotions of leaders within charter schools. Deans of students were much more likely to be chosen from among people of color, from Black people especially, and deans of instruction from white people. That is inexcusable. They're explanations, but it doesn't make them right. The broadening of the curriculum to include a much broader array of authors that relate more to students' lives is entirely a good thing. The sensitivity to ensuring that every representation of students is positive and affirming, this is great. So I want to be clear, there's a lot of good things. My concern is the turning away from the obsession with good teaching. Because if you're not obsessed with making classrooms great, and I just want to also personally add to what Robert said, Doug, we are so fortunate he's here because Doug did so much of that. Creating a taxonomy that would prepare novice teachers to be able to be effective quickly is one of the most important contributions of the century in education. So we need to get back to that. We need to get back to being obsessed with, are the kids learning? We taught them, yeah, but did they learn? And then going deep on where were the failure points in the lesson? What do we know about what our students got and didn't got? What was wrong in our lesson design? How do we fix it? How do we better prepare for the next lesson? Because we want every child to succeed, to have an experience of success every hour. That's a great school.
I think people people assume that the relationship between inputs and outcomes is linear with most things. So a great example of this would be, should you water your plants if you want them to survive? Yes, you absolutely should. But if you overwater your plants, you will also kill them. You know, and I think this is true about a lot of, like, stress is a great example of this. Like, can you have too much stress? And everyone thinks that stress is toxic. Stress is not toxic. Excessive stress is toxic. Actually, you need a certain amount of stress in a learning environment to create optimal learning. I think people tend to see the relationship between things that they believe in and think more of it, it is inherently better. If I keep emphasizing this thing that's important to me, it will lead me in a positive direction, and every curve turns. So I agree, like, students should see themselves in the curriculum. They should feel loved and supported by the school. We should be aware of disparities in our own hiring practices, and there are 1,000 things we should be aware of. Can we overdo those things? Can we become so obsessed with them and believe that by going down further and further down this spectrum that at some point the curve turns and we're no longer serving students? I think that's what's happened.
I'm reminded of something from 20 years ago. A colleague of mine in a low-performing public school in the South Bronx, who one day said, look, you know, reading and math is important, but I teach the whole child. Mm-hmm. And what she meant by that, at least how I interpret it, she's giving herself permission, frankly, to not be very good at the job that we were paying her to do. Mm-hmm.
Our executive director in New York City is an immigrant from Panama who raised her children in the Bronx. And she is constantly saying literacy is justice.
Yes.
Numeracy is justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it can be very powerful to have somebody with that experience emphasize that.
Yep. Stephen, you addressed this a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more about it. It's an online question. What are some areas where you think the recent social justice movements may have made some improvements?
Yeah, so I mentioned A couple of them. I think that the focus on broadening the curriculum and ensuring that the curriculum is representative of the cultures of the students being educated. Not entirely. You know, as the old expression in education goes, you want windows and mirrors, right? You want students to be able to see themselves in the stories that they read, the novels that they read. We all do, you know, as a result of our identities. That's our nature. We feel connected, we feel affirmed, we understand ourselves better, but we're also very curious people. We also want to learn about faraway cultures with different values, different approaches, different traditions, and children are just as excited by that. So it requires a balance. But I think that we didn't do enough of that in the past, and that has gotten better. Where it goes wrong is where you say, as happened at one recent major network, that a writing instruction book for middle school that was highly esteemed by the network was thrown out because it's written by 2 white women. You know, that makes no sense. So yes, I think there have been important things, but I think that but even in areas where there was a correct identification of a problem, that, as I said earlier, that inhabiting that warm, strict teacher stance that was so central to no excuses, the fact that that was hard, the solution is not to do away with discipline, not to throw out merit and demerit systems as Noble did, not to throw out uniforms, not to, most importantly, abandon the idea of we sweat the small stuff so we don't have to sweat the big stuff, which is a very powerful idea. That was the mistake. We could simply have made a correction. In the no excuses spirit, we could say, we have a problem here. We're not there yet. We need to fix this. Our cultural systems are not what they need to be. That would have been an appropriate response. We didn't need to throw everything out. Do you guys agree? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's well said.
And that's why we go into schools like the ones you're describing, Doug, and you see chaos, and kids are very unhappy.
Ian Rowe, my AEI colleague, sends in this question. I'll summarize it. He points out that, as he said, it's amazing that a discussion on raising expectations immediately devolves into social justice, anti-racism, racial equity, etc. Commenting on our previous conversation about how do we spur change here, he asks, is one path forward expanding the aperture to show that white students are being failed by the education system, and the reasons for that failure are likely what's causing underperformance for all kids?
100%.
Yes.
Okay.
Exclamation point.
Okay. We have, lots of hands. Jim Pizer, you're next.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for this incredibly rich conversation. 2 things. One is maybe a sign of hope or that change is possible. I think what's happened with the science of reading over the last several years, even during COVID, and during all of this sort of cultural upset, has really been remarkable.
Yeah.
And I think there's some lessons learned. Maybe just Emily Hanford needs to do a podcast about this. But nonetheless, there's something there which says things can actually change and change fairly quickly. The other is more of a question and a comment, is that the zeitgeist at the moment, especially at the secondary school level, is really much more around vocational technical education, career pathways, trying to figure out how to make education more purposeful and more focused on career and not college, which sort of brings to the question about whether the liberal arts and humanities lens is sort of striking the right chord at this moment, or whether there needs to be a broader definition of what that sort of educational experience looks like to incorporate more career-oriented education without somehow abandoning the sort of more liberal arts
So
purpose.
Jim, this is a great question, and I think of the Massachusetts reforms again, of which you were such a significant driver. What I find so striking about the Massachusetts reforms is that the voc tech schools were among the most improved by the Massachusetts reforms. So now we're at a point where those schools often outperform the surrounding comprehensive high schools. And part of that is because, and I should back up and say that when the act was being debated, the Voc-Tech schools were very strong opponents to the proposed legislation. And they said their students should be exempt from the 10th grade exit exam. They didn't get their way. But the schools changed. They brought Shakespeare in. They brought a liberal education to complement the professional skills education. Many of these schools, it's a week of trades education, and it's a week of academic education. And the kids are killing it in these schools. So I don't believe that we should lessen our intellectual ambitions for children, even if they're not planning to go to college. And moreover, in communities like Brownsville, New York, where we ran our schools, there was no path to college. So we at a minimum, have to at least provide a path to college for those families that want it in communities where there is none at all. So I think that both of these things can happen.
Our schools are pre-K through 8, and so it's really important for us that once our kids graduate from 8th grade, they have the option for college, but the value proposition of college is very different now than it once was. And even for my own children, I don't actually know that college is the right path for them. And I am very excited about rigorous career and technical education. I think that there are opportunities for that, and I actually think you can live a life of great meaning and purpose without going to college.
The gentleman just to Jim Piser's right, I believe, had a question as well. Yes, sir.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I'm a teacher in DC Public Schools, but don't let my title make you think that's all I know in education. I mean, I did my master's in Helsinki, Finland. I went to school in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, I taught English curriculum, the UK curriculum on a ship. Okay. So I'm very much exposed. But my question is, because I'm looking at the constant in the middle of the change, right? And if we go back to the father of American education, Horace Mann, and then we go over now to the progressive era with John Dewey and Teachers College, then the GI Bill era, we have technology era, and then we have this inclusion era. My question is, though, what I keep noticing, though, is that there has not been a philosophical change, where we constantly notice that it's almost as though the epistemological foundation of it all is that man is inherently good versus man being inherently evil. So my question is, how do we look at that philosophy with regards to influencing the mind, which is really driving the policies that we have today?
I'm struck by how grounded your question is in history in and of itself, which is so powerful, right? Maybe I can just pick up on a tiny piece of your question because it's so thoughtful. Is man inherently good or is man inherently bad? And I would say man is inherently a bell curve. But I think that this is one of the, people say all the time, kids are blank. If you're a DC public schools teacher, first of all, thank you. And second of all, I'm sure you know there are the most beautiful, incredible kids in the classroom, and there are kids who, God bless them, given an opportunity, they will bully other. You know, there's every type of child, just like there's every type of adult in every room full of classrooms, and I think we have to design our classrooms to honor and respect and support the best instinct in every child, and to shape and to bring out and shape the best version of every child. I think one of the most important ideas in education is just recognizing that the fundamental attribution error, right? We presume that people do what they do because of who they are, but often they're doing what they do because of the situation that you're put in. Keep going back to that picture you showed of that classroom what would you do if you were put in that classroom? You would take on a series of behaviors that would be adaptive to be able to survive in an environment like that. To first make sure that you weren't victimized, second to make sure that you had connections to other people so you didn't feel isolated, that people react to environment so much more than we recognize. So I think the first step for me is we want to build classrooms that bring the best out in everybody and disincentivize the side of every single person that can be non-constructive. In terms of, yeah, in terms of like large scale social changes, one of the other like generational changes I think about all the time is, every school is a collective action problem. Every classroom is a collective action problem. We have to get a group of people to make small sacrifices to not be able to do what they want to do in any moment in order to unlock the multiplicative greater common good for everyone in that classroom. And a generation ago, I think people understood that notion of like personal sacrifice for shared benefit much more clearly. And like if I had come home, my father made it clear to me that like if the principal called, it didn't matter if I was right or wrong. He wasn't my story was not going to be very important to him. There was going to be hell to pay, and maybe right or wrong. But I think now there are a lot of parents out there who want the school to optimize the individual. Well, that policy isn't right for my child. That might be true, and yet it still might be the right policy because it's best for the greatest number of students in the greatest number of situations. And I think that is very not 2021 zeitgeist of I might be. This is another one of those like nonlinear relations. Individualism is a good thing, right? You only have to look at China and North Korea and Russia to have any questions about that. But can there be an excess of individualism where we're so individualistic that we destroy the entities that allow us to create community and greater common good? I think that's also possible, and I think that it's happening in schools. I don't know if that might not count as epistemological, but I tried. It's a better question than my answer.
No, we are unfortunately at time, and that is a good note to end on, Doug. Thank you. I started this conversation by expressing that I was somewhat infuriated, Stephen, listening to your presentation. So I guess I'll end on the same note, because it is infuriating, right? We had the right answer, and we lost it.
We're on our way to the right answer. Or a better answer, yeah.
Amendment accepted. You're exactly right. There are no right answers, but there's a process. Some years ago, I listened to the historian John Meacham make a comment about how we should not judge figures of the past by contemporary standards. Instead, we should ask, what are we doing today that will make future generations say, my God, what were they thinking? Mm-hmm. And that's where I feel like we are right now. We had it. My God, what have we been thinking for this past lost decade? And how do we get back to what we know works? Stephen Wilson, Stephanie Soroki de Garcia, Doug Lamov, thank you very much.